All right, so hi, I'm Tiffany Fennell, Chair of the VA section or Veterans Affairs section of Division 18, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar that provides us with an overview of the guidelines for psychological practice with military service members, veterans, and their families, presented to us by Drs. John Curry and Mira Brancu. This webinar is sponsored by the VA section of APA Division 18, Psychologists and Public Service. And Division 18 is considered the home division for VA psychologists in APA, as well as for other public service psychologists, like those in state and public hospitals, Indian country, criminal justice, and police and public safety. For more information about Division 18 in the VA section, please check out the files and web links pods for a brochure and links to our website, Twitter, and Facebook page. And you'll also find a copy of today's slides in the files pod that you can download for reference. All questions can be entered into the chat box, and there'll be time left towards the end to answer questions. And if there are any technical difficulties, please let me know in the chat box and I'll attend to you as quickly as possible. So as you know, APA recently sent out a call for comments to the recently posted guidelines for psychological practice with military service members, veterans, and their families. With comments accepted through June 7th, I'm really appreciative for today's presenters for taking their time to provide an overview of these proposed guidelines. Our first presenter, Dr. John Curry, received his BA in philosophy from Villanova University and his doctorate in clinical psychology from the Catholic University of America. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and a diplomat in clinical psychology of the American Board of Professional Psychology. He is a professor in Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. He's also a psychologist with the Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center, otherwise known as the VISN 6 MIREC. At the MIREC, he leads the Family Interest Group, which includes researchers and practitioners involved in family-related research and intervention across the VISN. He's been involved in research on post-deployment parental reintegration and on mood and substance use disorders in military spouses and couples. He was a contributor to the DoD VA online training program called Parenting for Service Members and Families, and to the APA guidelines for practice with military service members, veterans, and their families. And our second presenter, Dr. Mira Brancu, received her BA in psychology from Binghamton University, her master's and advanced certificate in school counseling from the University of Maryland, College Park, her PhD in clinical psychology from the Catholic University of America, and a business certificate from the University of North Carolina's Keenan Flagler Business School. Dr. Brancu is Deputy Director of the VISN 6 MIREC and Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University. Her research and clinical interests focus on suicide assessment, intervention, and prevention, and post-deployment mental health of Iraq and Afghanistan era veterans. She supported the development of APA's guidelines for practice with military service members, veterans, and their families. So thanks again to you both for presenting, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Hi, everybody. This is Mira. Can you tell me by pressing the agree button up on top or raising your hand if you can hear me? Okay, good. Great. We have finagled some interesting microphone riggering here to make this work, so I'm glad you can hear me. So how many of you are or have been familiar with the way that APA develops professional practice guidelines? Go ahead and raise your hand again if you're familiar with how APA does this. Okay, so it looks like a number of you are actually familiar with it. So the first part, I'm going to give a brief overview for those who are not familiar with it, and those of you who are familiar with it, just jump in if you have additional things that you'd like to add. Somewhere around 2013, I joined the group that develops these guidelines, Committee on Professional and Practice Standards, COPS, for APA. and met John there through that as well. Well, actually, I recruited John to come help me, didn't I? um, and so that was kind of the first experience I've ever had with how to develop these guidelines, and it was really an interesting experience. And they were just starting to talk about should we have guidelines for military service members, veterans and their families, and if so, to what extent, should we, set it up for VA professionals versus DoD versus community. And so we spent quite a bit of time thinking through that and seeking input, reaching out to stakeholders to talk about these, and I'll tell you a little bit about that process. First, there's actually two different types of guidelines that, at least at that time, APA was developing. One set are called clinical practice guidelines, and the others, the ones that we were developing, are professional practice. So the clinical practice guidelines are recommendations about treatments. They're focused on specific conditions, and they're client-focused, and the purpose is to educate psychologists and healthcare systems about the most effective treatments available, empirically based, and the methodology is different. For professional practice guidelines, the recommendations are really focused on how psychologists practice around certain populations usually. And they're looking at emerging new areas often. There might not always be research in those areas, although we try to put as much of the newest information. They're expert and professional consensus-based. They're focused on the practitioner, sort of aspiring to the best ways of approaching working with a specific population. And they're informed by scientific literature, but also ethical codes and other sources of knowledge. They're different from the ethics code in that the ethics code is a set of standards that are mandatory. Guidelines are aspirational and they're educational. There's no enforcement mechanism within APA about guidelines. It's what we're seeking to in order to facilitate a high level of professional practice, whereas standards might be accompanied by some kind of enforcement mechanism. These are some examples of professional practice guidelines. There's some on telepsychology, for example, forensic psychology, all kinds of professional practice guidelines, and you can find them at that link below. Okay, so the way that they're developed and the approval process is some of them are developed internally by COPS, and this one was. This was something that we decided was important to us. To the people who were on the committee at that time were really interested in this area, including me. But other guidelines are developed by outside of COPS, and they use COPS as kind of consultants to help guide them through the process, because there is a certain kind of language, a certain structure to the guidelines, and there's a really specific review process that I'll share a little bit more about. So the language, I mentioned that it's educational and it's aspirational. So we don't use words like psychologists must do this or they should do that. It's really, what's the ideal? What are we striving for? What do we hope we could do our best to do that kind of is informed by the literature out there? And it's not dictating specific practices. And then the structure of the guidelines themselves, there's a guideline statement, there's a rationale or justification, so the knowledge that supports it, and then there's an application, how it would look like if the practitioner applied it. And approval process is lengthy. So I mentioned, you heard that I started with COPS in 2013, right? It's a 3-year term, and and so I stayed with them until 2015 when I served as the chair. And my goal was really to push these through, and now it's 2019. And they're finally out for public comment. This is the process that it goes through. So, of course, we were the committee that were kind of the lead committees. There were experts that we reached out to, and if I'm looking at this list of the folks who are listening in, I already see a few people, including Shirley Glynn. Thank you, Shirley. She served as one of quite a number of experts and to provide input and to review early drafts or to send us relevant literature on the guidelines. And we worked with a lot of people back and forth, lots of revisions. And then what happens is it goes through a review of all of the boards and committees within APA, as well as the ethics folks and the legal folks, and they're all trying to make sure that it meets all the requirements and guidelines. Then finally, it goes to public comment, which is what we are doing now. So this public comment, it's 90 days. It closes for this one, I think, John, do you remember the date?
June 7th, I think.
June 7th, thank you. So right around the corner at this point. And so what we're doing is reaching out to our stakeholders, especially the ones that are kind of highest priority, like Division 18, on our list that we think, this group is going to have a lot of great knowledge and feedback that can make sure that our guidelines are looking good. So then once that happens, it comes back. We do another revision process to respond to the public comments, and then it goes through another iteration of the APA office staff, general counsel, legal, regulatory staff, that kind of thing, board of directors, council of representatives again. And then finally, publication in the American Psychologist. They might develop some CE programs and things like that. And it's really good timing, and I'm really hoping that we can really move this forward now that we have the kind of updated Mission Act for VA, which is kind of a new iteration of giving veterans access and choice to use community providers as they choose if they meet certain requirements, like, for example, if they're not close enough to local VA. And so, to me, that's really the most important applicability for these guidelines, because what we decided is that they're especially focused on psychologists who don't necessarily have as much training in terms of working in the VA with veterans or working in DoD, but are community providers. The guidelines actually used to be called guidelines for community providers, because our hope is to put some aspirational guidelines around best practices for working with veterans, military service members, and their families. So that is the whole process. And it also speaks to this idea of making sure psychologists provide services that are within the boundaries of their competence. So if veterans and military service members and their families are to seek mental health care in the community, we want to make sure that they are competent and trained to do so. And so that's also really important to us. And that they understand various factors within this population in terms of subpopulation needs. So it could be gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, age, gender, national origin, all of these differences between subgroups among veterans. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I mentioned this. Well, Also, the importance about guidelines is also related to, for example, mid-career psychologists in terms of maintaining competence. So if they are starting to see a new population that they've never seen before, or they've been out of school for a while, or they're mentoring younger psychologists, making them aware of what is kind of the newest and most up-to-date information about working with this population. And the same, of course, would go for later career psychologists, especially those who are in the position to delegate work to others and supervise and mentor and train. This is where the guidelines are again. Okay, so I am going to stop there and open it up to see if there's any questions so far just about the process and kind of what it takes to kind of develop these guidelines. Okay, hearing and seeing no questions yet, I'm going to now pass it on to John, who's going to actually discuss the guidelines themselves.
Okay, thanks, Mira. Yeah, I'm glad to be here and happy to talk with you about this project, and I hope we would really encourage you to look at the guidelines and give comment during the public comment period, if at all possible. So I'm going to go through the current draft, which is the one that's posted for public comment, and as Mira said, it will be revised again after the comment, so these are not the final guidelines. There's an introductory section which gives the background and the rationale for the guidelines. So it begins with a very brief section on the history of military matters in psychology, including the founding of Division 19, which was one of the charter divisions when APA was restructured in 1945. And this section of Division 18, Psychologists in Public Service, as well as the very prominent role of the VA in the history of training clinical psychologists. And then it goes through some data from APA which show that a relatively small percentage of all psychologists see service members frequently or very frequently, but almost a fifth report that they see veterans frequently or very frequently. And this is likely to increase because of the potential now for veterans to seek care outside of the VA under certain circumstances, which Mira mentioned. On the other hand, relatively few psychologists report high levels of perceived cultural competency with military or veteran clients. This study is cited in the guidelines. It shows that about a quarter of TRICARE providers and only 8% of non-TRICARE providers rate themselves as culturally competent to provide services to service members and veterans. Whereas among psychologists in the VA or the Department of Defense, about 70% rate themselves competent. So the guidelines are primarily targeted at the non-VA DoD providers. There are 4 guidelines. I'm going to go through each of them. The first one is called Orientation to Military Culture, and it points out that military experience and military culture might be important to individuals who are seeking psychological practice. Seeking psychological services. And it's sort of analogous to other demographic variables that might or might not be important in any given case, such as race and gender and age. So the first guideline is psychologists endeavor to ask all clients about past or current military status. So this would be a recommendation to make this a routine part of the intake procedure. And I'm not going to repeat the first two words all the time, but basically all of the guidelines are phrased in such a way that they start with something like psychologist's endeavor or psychologist's attempt, something like that. It's that aspirational language that Mira mentioned. Secondly, psychologists try to understand the impact that military culture and experience has on the client's views of themselves and others, while at the same time understanding how heterogeneous the military and veteran population is. And third part of this guideline is that psychologists consider the impact of their own personal attitudes, biases, beliefs, and knowledge about military culture on their work with service members, veterans, and their families. So they may have a very positive or a very negative attitude toward the military based on their own experience, and that kind of attitude could bias their work. So on the one hand, this guideline recommends to psychologists that they find out about the impact of military experience and culture on the client, but also that they take into account their own attitudes about the military. So that's the shortest of the guidelines, and the next ones are more detailed. The second guideline is to consider factors in assessment and intervention. First, to be aware of common stressors that are faced by service members, veterans, and their families. One of them would be the deployment cycle. This has been identified by a number of mental health and psychological researchers. It's the cycle through which service members and their families go when the service member is deployed. And it reviews, the material in this section reviews some of the stressors that have been identified in the pre-deployment, deployment, and post-deployment reintegration periods. Also, some of the common demands of living in a combat zone, for example, the degree of vigilance that's required when you're living in a combat zone, which is necessary in a combat zone but can become a liability when you come back to live with your family. And the impact of service members' absence from major family events while they're deployed. So a number of authors have talked about the fact that service members during deployment will often miss a major life event in the life of their child, for example. And they may also miss broader family-related life events. So those are some of the common stressors. Secondly, psychologists are encouraged to become aware of common mental health conditions and factors among the military and veteran population. Some of these are diagnoses, such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. I think it's probably fair to say that depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders are common in almost any population that they would work with, but PTSD is more common among military personnel than among other populations they may work with. There can also be differences based on service era. For example, the way that Vietnam veterans were treated when they returned home is quite different from the way contemporary military service members are treated when they return home. Becoming aware of the impact on the families of these factors. So there's a good bit of information in the literature on the effect of PTSD on the marriage, and then the effect of PTSD on parenting. Some of this we review in the guidelines. There's a recommendation to become aware of factors in combat injuries and military sexual trauma that are relevant for many military and veteran service members, and to become aware of technology-related factors such as the improvement in equipment leads to more survival rates, but also means there are more veterans living with things like traumatic head injury and physical injuries that might not have survived in earlier combat periods. And then there's a recommendation for psychologists to make themselves aware of the evidence-based interventions for these disorders, and in particular for PTSD. The third part of Guideline 2 is to recommend that psychologists familiarize themselves with the resources that are available to their clients. These could be resources in the Department of Defense or the VA, community agencies that have a particular emphasis on services for military and veteran families, and also relevant legislation or policy. So in this case, as far as policy goes, that is kind of a moving target. So we recommend that people try to keep up with it. We don't put in there, that this policy is the way it is, because it could be changed in another couple of weeks. We recommend that providers become aware of specialty services in the VA, evidence-based practices that have been adapted for service members and veterans, and policy on veteran access to non-VA services. An example of an evidence-based practice adapted for service members and veterans is the parenting interventions that have been developed up in Minnesota, which are tailored toward National Guard veterans. And then the fourth part is to understand factors that may affect the service member or veteran's ability to engage in treatment. So understanding how military culture and experience may be correlated with stigma, or may go against the help seeking that's required, the attitude of help seeking that's required to engage in psychological services, because that is in conflict with the strong emphasis on self-reliance. And then also providers need to be aware of some of the personal strengths that the client brings based on military experience, such as their experiences in leadership. Okay, Guideline 3 is very diverse. It really is a set of subpopulations that may have particular concerns that providers need to be aware of. So I think I'm not sure, I think I've got all of them on here, but at least have most of them, the ones that are included in the current version of the guidelines. So different generations of veterans. I mentioned before the experience of the Vietnam veterans having been different from contemporary veterans. Also World War II veterans, Korean veterans, Gulf War veterans. There may be factors that they experienced which could be relevant to their need for services. Special needs of racial and ethnic minority service members and veterans. Women veterans, of course, is an area of a lot of current emphasis because of the growing proportion of women in the military. and some of the stressors that they have faced. Veterans with service-connected disability benefits, rural veterans who are less likely to be able to obtain services locally, veterans involved in the justice system, homeless veterans, and sexual and gender minority veterans. So in the guidelines, there's a paragraph or two about each of these subpopulations and some of the literature that has been done showing frequent concerns that are related to being a member of these subpopulations. And then the general guideline is to be cognizant of this when you're working with them. So the examples here, including the high rates of military sexual trauma, sexual assault and harassment, and among homeless veterans, the complex set of problems that they often bring in, including physical disorders, psychiatric diagnosis, and substance abuse. This is a typo here. This is guideline 4 rather than guideline 5, but this has to do with the families. So this is the section on service members and their families. Again, as in the initial guideline, it's recommended that providers ask all clients whether they are a parent, partner, child, or dependent of a service member or veteran. It's known that military spouses seeking care for themselves and parents seeking care for their child, even while their service member is in active duty, most often rely on civilian providers, and of course this is even more true when the service member becomes a veteran. And I think it's probably true that most providers in the community don't routinely ask this, so we're suggesting that it would be a good idea to do so, to understand the context. Second, try to understand the effects of military status and deployment on the families. The effect of geographic moves on the children, including changes in peer groups, schools, some evidence. There's all kinds of interesting evidence on the school performance of military kids. It's not easy to simplify, but basically, there's some evidence that school performance can decline during a deployment, but on the other hand, military kids tend overall to do better in school. So we talk about a few of these issues in the guidelines to help providers become aware of them. Same way with peer relations. Military children do experience more disruptions in peer groups, but on the other hand, they develop skills at forming new friendships that perhaps are better than those of other kids. The challenges in each phase of the deployment cycle that are faced by the spouse or partner and by the children, and including the post-deployment family reintegration period, which some evidence suggests is in some ways the most difficult period. The positive growth and increased competencies that family members can develop when their loved one is deployed. And then the special stressors that are associated with being a member of the Guard or Reserve, such as not living on or near a base and not being surrounded by other families who are going through the same things. The third part of this guideline is to recommend that the provider understand the family context and, if it's appropriate, involve the family system when working with a service member or veteran. So the evidence now indicates that about half or more of service members are married, and over 40% of active duty service members have children. There are also family members who are caregivers for veterans who have a mental health or substance use problem. And there seems to be a bidirectional effect of family functioning and the functioning of the service member or veteran. The effects of PTSD on marriage and parenting I mentioned before is a good example of where you may want to involve the couple and maybe in some circumstances the whole family. The importance of intimate partner violence in both military and civilian communities. And the fact that some veterans prefer to have their partner or their other family member or support person involved in their own mental health care. So this is a summary of the recommended best practices that I've just gone through. In terms of asking and exploring with clients, the guidelines recommend asking clients about past or current military experience and asking also if your client is a parent, spouse, partner, child, or dependent of a service member or veteran, and exploring with them the possible impact of military experience and culture on the reasons that they're coming in for services. And then we recommend the provider increase their own awareness about their attitudes, biases, and beliefs about military culture, frequent stressors and mental health problems in military and veteran populations, strengths of the service member and veteran populations, and evidence-based interventions and other resources. So this current draft is, well, these slides were made up about a month ago, so the first sentence is outdated. They have been posted for public comment in April. Public comment then is sent, it's collected in a big Excel sheet and then sent to the committee working on the guidelines, and then that committee, which Mira and I are on, will make revisions based on the public comment feedback. Then that final version goes back to APA governance and legal review, and when all is completed, then the final version is published in the American Psychologist. So I think that takes care of the slide presentation, and we can open it up for questions.
Thanks, John. And some things, this is Mira again, some things that John touched on, but I wanted to sort of highlight. The guidelines are for psychologists, and like I mentioned, we aimed it toward psychologists in the community that may not necessarily see this group as frequently or are starting to open up their practices to see more military service members, veterans, and their families, or don't have as much training, although really this is useful for orienting any psychologist in whatever setting to kind of the big picture main things. And often what happens when these guidelines are published is that even though they're specifically for psychologists, other mental health professionals in the community will adopt or reference it if they don't have a comparable document or guidance. So we kind of thought about that as well. We had to answer a few questions for ourselves when we were developing these. The first is, what would not be a dissertation of all the things we know about this group, because there's much, but would be useful, accessible, and digestible enough as an overview guidance of the most important things you need to know. The second is, what was specifically unique to veterans, service members, and their families that might be different from civilians? So if we found the literature suggested it's quite comparable or similar, we didn't necessarily include it in there. We tried to very much focus in on the unique aspects of understanding this population. And finally, the question of like each guideline, we want to make sure that the rationale, the justification for including that guideline, there wasn't enough knowledge out there to justify including it. Do we have enough to talk about? If we felt like it was still really emerging and there's a lot more research to be done in that area, we didn't necessarily include it. These guidelines are often, they come with an expiration date of 10 years, at which point it's decided, either to sunset them or to update them. We decided to actually give them a shorter timeline of about 5 years because there's so much more emerging research in certain areas that we thought probably within 5 years they would need to be updated. So that might be helpful for folks to know about as well. And I think that's kind of most of the main questions we get around how they're developed and kind of what was the decision making about what to include versus not including. John, anything else that I missed that you want to include?
No, I think you covered it. It's good, yeah.
Great. All right, so in the last 15 minutes, we just wanted to open it up and see if anybody had any feedback for us, any questions.
Well, maybe people can enter their questions into the chat box. This is Tiffany, and I'll just chime in to say that, wow, I'm really impressed. And thank you so much for the work that you two and the others on the committee have put into these guidelines. I was just
Thanks so much.
I was just recently recalling I had a kind of a, I don't know, snafu, I don't know what you call it, but it recently became apparent that even just different eras, I had more experience working with like veterans from the Korean War era and Vietnam era than Gulf War, and so it was a realization to me. So I'm really glad that some of that is included in these guidelines. There can be some differences even between veterans in different eras. So
yeah,
that's a great point, and thank you for your kind words. And I should say, it was a small group, but there's a lot of people that participated in reviewing and giving us feedback, and we in the guidelines they are all included and thanked and acknowledged, and that includes quite a number of experts within the VA as well.
I'm seeing some typing in the chat box.
okay.
Let's see. Oh, here we go. Here's a question from Shirley Glenn. So she writes, you guys have done an amazing job. The big issue is getting the community trained, especially with the impending Mission Act. Are you offering guidance on training opportunities? How will community folks learn to do this?
That's a great question. I don't think we have anything in there on training at this point. Do we, Mira?
Not in there, but yeah. So often what they'll do is they'll do kind of a I don't think it's called a media blitz necessarily, but like an announcement that the guidelines are out there. Then they'll offer CE credits through the American Psychologists, and then additional talks and trainings, really talks like this afterwards. However, we're always interested in recommendations, and Shirley, if you want to be on board for that, we'd love to have you join and help help us create some of those things, because I think you're right, that's the next step once they come out, is getting them out there in the hands of community providers.
Yeah, that's right.
And Shirley adds, I would certainly be willing to share ideas and resources. That's great, Shirley.
Yay.
Great, thank you. Very good.
I'm seeing some more typing in the chat box too.
Okay.
I was just thinking, related to Shirley's comment or question, I think there is like a provider or community provider toolkit. I can't remember specifically. If I knew it offhand, I would include it in the chat box, but I don't have that. But there may be some kind of trainings maybe to help, increase, competencies and things like that. Here's a question from Helena. I agree with the training issues. Also, issues of institutional betrayal come up with veterans. Is that addressed?
I think what's in there that touches on this, although it's not emphasized, is the wide variety of reactions that clients themselves have had to their connection to the military or the VA, so that for a slightly different example, for some people it's a core element of their identity, and for others it's not. Some people feel very positively toward their experience, and some feel negatively. So, in that limited sense, this is in there, but I'm not sure. I would say it. I don't think it rises to the level of like institutional betrayal. I don't know. What do you think, Mira?
Yeah, no, I think keep it much more general to just being knowledgeable about the different ways that veterans, service members, and their families could relate to being in the military, that it's not just one perspective and one way that they've had a relationship to serving. Oh, that's a great point, though, Helena. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions, or recommendations? And if not now, but you sort of think about it later, especially, please do check out the link to the public comment request and submit it.
And that link to the public comments is found on the webinar flyer for today's webinar. It's a link towards the bottom of the flyer. And you can, if you've misplaced that, you can find it in the files pod. It's one of the flyers that you can download from today, along with today's slides. Well, I'll go ahead and wrap things up unless there's any last words from our presenters.
No, thank you very much to you, Tiffany, and to Division 18 and to everyone that joined us today for your interest. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we do. Thanks very much.
I know. I certainly appreciate the walkthrough. And yeah, Helena's also commenting on the huge effort and lots of work, so thank you. And
thanks, Helena.
Thanks for the walkthrough. It's really informative. And before we go, I just want to give a quick plug for our next VA section webinar that's coming up later this week on May 2nd. It's first episode Psychosis Interventions in VA, presented by Drs. Amy Wilson, Shirley Glenn, Rachel Calixt, and Emily Gagan. And then next week, Dr. Rodney Baker comes back and presents part 2 of the history of VA psychology and psychology training. He'll be covering years 1966 through 2016. And you can find flyers for both of these webinars in the files pod, so you can download and be sure to register. And so thanks everybody for attending today, and goodbye.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.